welcome to the Parliamentary Pavilion here at COP28. For this session, we're going to receive a briefing on the Green Climate Fund. I'm delighted to welcome Simon Wilson, who's going to step to the podium. And Simon, the floor is yours, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations. I think this is the first time you've had a Globe Pavilion here at COP, which is great news. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be able to speak to global legislators, both online and offline as well. And good luck in developing this initiative as well. I think this is really important. So what I'd like to talk to you about a little bit is about the role of GCF, the Green Climate Fund, within this global COP agenda. So the Green Climate Fund is a dedicated climate fund. We were set up by the UNFCCC back at another COP in 2010 in Cancun, and we were set up to be the financial arm, part of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. And since the Paris Agreement in 2015, we also serve the Paris Agreement. So what is our role? As part of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, there was an understanding that climate finance is critical to achieving global goals, that we will proceed with each country setting its own priorities, its own goals for climate change, but that not every country has the same resources available to enable them to implement those goals. So to overcome those barriers, the UNFCCC set up a mechanism to channel finance, climate finance, to developing countries. Green Climate Fund's role is to aid that, to support the transition, the transfer of finance to developing countries to help them to achieve their goals. And we do that in two ways, supporting adaptation and supporting mitigation. So helping to build resilience of people in developing countries and also helping to finance the transition towards low carbon sustainable development, whether through the forms of renewable energy or energy efficiency. So there are a number of funds at COP. In fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of different sources of finance around at COP. And one of the discussions over the last 2 weeks has been, how do we overcome this fragmentation of different sources of climate finance? You can get finance from many multilateral sources, from climate funds, from other funds, but also, of course, bilaterally from development aid through bilaterally from particularly from developed countries, but of course as well, most significantly, private sector investment in climate outcomes in developing countries. So how do we overcome that kind of fragmentation? Well, the first thing that we're doing as Green Climate Fund is we are here at COP this year for the first time with a joint pavilion together with 3 other climate funds. So there's the Green Climate Fund. We are the world's largest dedicated climate fund. There is also the Adaptation Fund. This is a smaller fund, principally grant-based, making grants for development for adaptation in developing countries as well. Then thirdly, we're working with the Global Environment Facility. This is our sister fund, which was created not under the climate negotiations process, but under the biodiversity and environmental negotiations process starting back in Rio in 1992. So they work on environment and biodiversity, but of course there's increasingly a crossover with climate change as well. So thirdly, we work with them. And then finally, we're present here with the Climate Investment Funds, the CIFs, which is another financial mechanism to channel climate funding, but this one is via the multilateral development banks. It's hosted at the World Bank, so they work with a few of the larger multilateral development banks. So that can be a confusing universe of different climate sources. And one of the reasons why we are here collectively in a single pavilion is to help to try to increase what we call complementarity and coherence, which is UNFCCC code word for how do we work together more closely. So how do developing countries manage to figure out who they should go to for climate finance, which is the best source of funding, how they can be combined together, how they can leverage their own strengths together. So that's been very exciting for us to be present together as the 4 funds. Perhaps I can say a little bit about specifically what the Green Climate Fund does, what our mandate is, and particularly for legislators, I guess, how would we relate to legislators both in developing countries and developed countries as well? What is our interaction with them? What is our interface with them as well? So our mandate is, first of all, to support developing countries in making this transition towards low carbon sustainable development and to adapt their populations, protect them from the impacts of climate change. Our funding comes primarily from developed countries. So we are replenished on a 4-year cycle with funds that are contributed to us by developed countries, and that money is then allocated to developing countries by our board, which is co-owned in the same way as COP is a balance between developed and developing countries. Our board is made up of 24 countries, 12 from developing countries, 12 from developed countries, and they try wherever possible to make decisions by consensus. Now, when allocating those funds for climate projects, we divide that effort 50% towards adaptation, 50% towards mitigation. Now that's important because we know that globally there's a huge gap in adaptation finance. There is much more climate finance going towards renewable energy transition than there is going towards resilience and protecting populations. So one of the key features of the Green Climate Fund is we balance that funding, so 50% of that goes towards adaptation. Now, but we know that some countries are hit much harder than others by climate change impacts, and some countries have many fewer resources to address climate change. So within that funding, within the 50% of our funds that go to adaptation, we have a floor, we have a minimum amount of 50% that goes to least developed countries, small island developing states, and African states. So that's the priority group for us. That's a floor, but in fact, we've already reached 67%, just over 2/3 of our adaptation funding goes to those priority countries. Overall, across our whole portfolio, over half of it goes towards least developed countries, small island developing states in Africa. So that's really where we're trying to focus our attention. Those are the countries most in need on both the mitigation and on the adaptation side. In terms of how we work through, we're based in Korea, we're based in the Republic of Korea, which is unusual. Most international organizations are based in New York or Geneva. When we were set up, we're one of the youngest international governmental organizations, one of the last ones to be set up this century. And when we were set up, there was an idea that there are probably enough organizations in New York, there are probably enough in Geneva, let's place the Green Climate Fund in a different location. Korea was the one who won, and so we are all hosted in the Republic of Korea. But we operate around the world in over 160 countries. All of the countries who are eligible, who are parties to the UNFCCC, who are not the developed country parties, are eligible for funds. So we operate around the world, but from a base in Korea. How do we do that? How do we know what the priorities of countries are while we're based in Korea? We don't. We would not be able to do that from Korea. We work through a partnership network. So first of all of our projects are implemented by a network of 121 partners who we operate with around the world. Now those partners range from huge international organizations, from the World Bank, from the main UN agencies, UN Development Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, from the World Health Organization, right the way down through to private sector organizations like HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Japanese bank MUFG, so many very large international organizations, public and private. But we work all the way also with very small organizations at the local level, what we call direct access. And 2/3 of our accredited entities, of our project partners, are actually either national or regional organizations in the global south, in developing countries. Those can be civil society organizations, they could be foundations, they could actually be government ministries or environment agencies, or they could be local development banks or regional development banks, or even private sector organizations within the global south. So one of the things we're really trying to do is to bring that climate finance down to be spent at the most local level possible. Locally led adaptation has been a big theme of the COP, and that's something we're trying to address by working with local partners through the development. So we work through those partners. The second thing we do, though, is we make sure we have country ownership of the projects that we are implementing. So it's not possible for us to decide, it's not appropriate for us to decide what projects should take place within a particular country. That needs to be determined by the countries themselves. Our role is to help the countries to translate their NDC ambitions, so the ambitions under their nationally determined contributions, the pledges they make at COP every year, to translate those into a bankable list of actionable projects. So how do we turn that ambition into the action, into the reality? And we do that in two ways. Firstly, we provide what we call capacity building support, readiness support to those countries to help them to have the capacity to turn those ambitions into a list of priorities which can then be financed at the project level. And secondly, we make sure that when we do finance projects, the larger scale climate action projects we fund, we have to ensure that we have country ownership of those projects. So every project that takes place in a country can only take place once we have what we call a no objection letter in that country. So that government certifies that this project matches their national priorities. It's not something that's imposed top down by funders or by others on the country. It's something that matches the priorities of the country and builds upon those. So those are the two ways in which we try to ensure that we have country ownership and local scale adaptation action for our projects. So to date, we have, in terms of the numbers, let me give you a few figures. We have a portfolio of $13.8 billion worth of projects. That's 243 projects spread across 129 countries around the world. So that's a lot of projects. The average size of those projects ranges from around $10 million at the smallest level to around $300 million in terms of GCF's contribution. Once you add in co-financing from other sources, from public sources, whether governments, other agencies, entities, or private sources as well, that amount goes over $50 billion. So that's our portfolio. That's the shape of the projects that we're implementing. What are they about? I mentioned it's a mixture, it's a balance between mitigation and adaptation. What kind of projects are we talking about? Well, we work across all of the sectors. So obviously renewable energy, energy efficiency on the energy side, but also energy access increasingly is a focus for us. For example, we have a new project called Hardest to Reach in Africa, where we are delivering energy for those who are off-grid, who don't currently have access to energy. We're delivering low-emission renewable energy to those households who are currently off-grid across 16 African countries. This builds upon an earlier project where we worked in Rwanda and Kenya and Uganda, and we're now taking that across Africa. We're doing that by investing through a partner, Acumen, in a number of small and medium-sized enterprises in those countries who are themselves providing off-grid household solar solutions. So they are selling and leasing household grid solutions to provide energy to those who've never had it before, but making sure it's low carbon energy, solar powered energy at source. So that's just one example of the kind of thing that we're trying to do across the range. But we're also active alongside energy. We're providing solutions in adaptation. That can range from water projects, looking at sustainable water supplies, water conservation, water reuse, water waste treatment facilities, right the way through to food and agriculture, where we're looking at sustainable agriculture practices. We're looking at also sustainable infrastructure. So we have projects looking at sustainable infrastructure within cities or within public buildings to make sure that they can withstand and are resilient towards the kind of climate shocks that are being faced. And also we have projects in the eco-based system area. So looking at biodiversity and ecosystems, how can we use natural solutions to climate change? That might be planting mangroves to help to restore degraded land and protect against erosion of land, to restore land for agricultural value in future, for example. So we're working across a whole range of sectors and a whole range of countries to a range of partners. That's kind of how we deliver that. So let me talk about legislators. What is the role? How would we relate to them? What is the role? Well, I guess there are two ways, and it relates to whether we're talking about legislators in developed countries, in contributor countries, or in developing countries. Let me start, first of all, with a few words around contributors. Now, our contributors come largely from developed countries. Our main contributors are from the US, Canada, European countries, Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries as well. So they're spread across the developed world. All of those funds are committed on a voluntary basis, and those are public funds, and we take that responsibility very seriously. We are being entrusted with public resources to allocate towards global finance goals. It's critically important for us that we can be transparent and accountable in the way that we use those funds towards those who provide them. Now, we can do that. That's where the role of legislators comes in and is key, because legislators are often the ones who are asking the questions about the use of public resources, the use of public funds, and so we can go, and we're very happy to do so, to go and speak to parliamentary commissions, audits, inquiries, questions, debates, to try and provide information around how those resources are spent, particularly because when you're contributing towards a global fund like the Green Climate Fund, that can seem quite distant from the taxpayer who's providing those funds within the contributor country. So it's up to us to try and do what we can to bridge the gap, to try and show there's accountability, there's transparency, and also to understand feedback around the way in which we use those resources, how we can do so better in future. So that's one of the things that we do with contributor countries, working with parliaments, giving them feedback on what we're doing, listening to their comments about how we can do that better. And that can be about ensuring we have stronger climate impact from our projects, but it can also be about making sure that we have better protection for the use of those funds through integrity protection to make sure that we protect against waste, mismanagement, or fraud, for example. So there are lots of ways in which that conversation, those discussions with with legislators in contributor countries can be very useful to us. So the second dimension is within developing countries where we are actually active. Now there it's critical for us that we have country ownership. Too often there's the perception that donors come in, they impose their priorities upon countries, and projects take place, investments take place with very little buy-in, very little understanding from the local population. That's where legislators, of course, can play a critical role in helping us to understand the priorities of those countries, but also to explain the ways in which the projects that we're implementing are relating to those priorities that are set out by the countries. And then finally, also, by helping to some cases to build a broader base of public understanding through consultations, through debates in the legislative chambers around the use of climate funds specifically and the priorities for climate change policies in future. So we'd also be very interested to talk to legislators around how we can improve that interface. As I said, we're a small secretariat based in Korea, so we are very distant, but we are very happy to be able to be accountable both to the contributors and also to the countries that we're operating in to try to understand how we can be more effective in the ways in which we use those resources. So perhaps with that, I can wrap up and see if there's any questions.
Minutes for some Q&A. I think there will be interest.
Sure.
And so let's just open it up. First of all, thank you so much, Simon. That was an absolute tour de force of explaining the purpose and the mechanisms of the Green Climate Fund. Also appreciate you really putting it into context because, as you said, there are hundreds of funds out there and it is quite difficult to understand from a legislator's perspective, from a layperson's perspective, how to navigate that. So if I can open it up to questions, please do identify yourself. We are live streaming. Let me start behind myself. There you go. So please do identify yourself and your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Caroline. I'm from Kenya. And I work closely with members of parliament in terms of making them, have access to such resources. And so my question particularly, I have an intervention and a question. One being, we have interacted with the GCF process in my country for parliamentarians specifically. And that is through the process of Parliamentarians for Climate Finance, where we are working with Climate Parliament and UNIDO to access climate readiness funds for their capacity building. So I am, we're in that process of finalizing on this. But my question is, why is the process so difficult? We have so many layers of bureaucracy. These funds are, in my view, are available for developing countries to use and for them to build their capacity. And this is what members need to know. Particularly because this funding is, you want to take members through their role and tell them you need to do this, you need to question public officials in this way and that way. Yet they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the capacity. So our role here at the Parliament of Kenya is to actually attract this funding for their capacity to know what they need to ask, to ask the right questions, and then now make the country make laws that make the country ready for climate finance, make them attractive for the bankable projects you're talking about. So why is the process so hard? Well, I really want this process to end because you've started this conversation early this year in May, and until next year, about March, is when we can really get a finality on these funds. Probably you can just give us a few ideas and why is the process so difficult? Thank you.
Shall I take a couple and then you can answer both of them? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. That was very informative. My name's Adil. I work for Air Quality Asia, which focuses on loss and damage financing, which I know is separate to what GCF does. But I'm curious what the funding gap is in like a high ambition energy transition scenario. How much money do you think we need between now and 2030? And I know like developed nations give money into the fund. Do the private markets also give money into the fund, or are there other sources of funding that GCF is trying to tap into? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very clear presentation. I'm with the Federated States of Micronesia's National Congress.
Sorry,
With the Federated States of Micronesia. My name is Charlotte Rusica. And I would actually have a follow-up question to my colleague's question, which is then what do you do to make it more easily accessible? so why, and then what's next, and we get this question a lot in my country, and we need a lot of money to adapt because we're going underwater, and our fate as small islands. And to give you a little bit of context, I believe that the Federated States of Micronesia actually has the smallest accredited entity with the GCF in the world. I believe, yeah, and I think it's MCT, Micronesia Conservation Trust, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, thank you.
Over to you, Simon.
Okay, so let's. I'll take the questions on access first, and then come back to your question, Ideal. So, first of all, to say that I'm aware of this project. It's a really interesting and innovative project. I'm not aware of anything like that that's been done before, and I think it will be really exciting to see this come forward, because it can really help to build a role for parliamentarians in action. So it is really exciting. It's great to see it's coming through, but we need to make sure that we can fund that as quickly as we can. On the access question generally, this is definitely a challenge. It's one of the key themes that we've heard coming through COP is, okay, we need to improve access to climate finance. What does that mean? There's several dimensions to that. One is about speed. One of them I've already mentioned. It's about complexity. It's about the fragmentation and the number of different places to go. How do you figure out how to go to those different places, and how do you deal with the multiple different application forms and procedures and different ones? So we are working on that with other funds to try to harmonize and simplify that, but that is a major challenge. And if you take, any country, but particularly if you took a small Pacific island, you can be faced with up to 100 different sources of finance for a particular project. Even just figuring out, where do I go? Multilateral, bilateral, climate fund, adaptation fund, it's very complicated. So we want to do two things. One is to just be simpler about or to improve our communication around complementarity. So how do we explain, okay, we do this really well, these guys do this better, these guys, this is their role, to be able to give you a picture of that so that you can understand, okay, probably my best option is going to be here rather than here. We haven't got to that stage yet, and we need to do it. But that's one step. The next one is actually simplifying and harmonizing processes. Now, harmonizing is ambitious because you've got 4 different processes that have been set up with different policies, different boards, trying to work out a way in which we can not compromise on standards and quality, but at the same time make that greater harmonization is definitely a challenge. It's one that we're stepping up to, and we're committing to do something on that. More generally around access, speed is a key issue, and this is the one that you were mentioning before in relation to Kenya. How do we improve speed? For us, it's that we have to acknowledge that there are always going to be challenges in terms of delivering climate finance very rapidly, because we have a dynamic tension between the need to ensure that we have impact for the results, for the funding that we're delivering, and that there is assurance of guarantees of the way in which these funds are being spent for the public taxpayers who are providing those funding, versus the needs to get climate funding on the ground very rapidly as well. So it is about making sure we have impact. For us as the Green Climate Fund, one of the key elements is that our projects have to have climate at their core. They have to have a climate objective, and we measure that in several ways. We look at whether or not the project is going to have a climate impact in terms of its ability to reduce emissions or to increase reduce the vulnerability of people who are at risk. So how efficient is it going to be at doing that? We also look at whether it's going to be what we call paradigm shifting. If you look at the demand for climate finance, and this comes to your question, Adil, as well, about how much demand is out there, it vastly exceeds the resources that we have. We know that. We could fund 10 times the projects that we're funding at present. We're already funding projects as quickly as we receive the money. I know it may seem that it takes us time to run through application procedures, but we are not sitting on any money. We are approving it as soon as we get the money from contributors. We are allocating it to new projects as quickly as we can. But however efficient we become, we do not have enough resources, and that means we have to make sure that when we do allocate, we try to find the best way to get the most impact that we can for the money. That means we try to find projects that are paradigm shifting. Often what that means is projects that are replicable, projects where you can apply it, test it in one area. If it works, you can do it somewhere else. I think that would be a classic example of the project that you were talking about. If this works, it's something that could be applied elsewhere. But another example might be a project where we're testing a new market. So we're going into new market. Recently, for example, we set up a blue-green bank in Barbados, setting up an institution for the first time to try to tap into green and blue bonds to access private finance for projects in the Caribbean. Now, if that works, that could be replicated around the world, and we wouldn't have to put our money in next time. Private sector could do so because we'd be able to demonstrate that there is a revenue return, that project works. So replicability is there. It is also important in the criteria that we use to demonstrate efficiency and effectiveness. That's what's more difficult, because it means that we have to be sure that, for example, if we're giving a loan for a project that is a renewable energy project, we will give concessional loans. We'll give below the market rates, and we'll give longer term loans to help those to be set up. But if we go in with loans that are too concessional, then we might crowd out any private sector banks which are already trying to offer in the local market those solutions. So we have to judge the level of concessionality to be able to open up the market, but without undermining and killing essentially a private sector market by coming in with a one-off public sector investment, which, okay, it gives cheap money initially, but then there's no sustainability to the process. It can't be done on an ongoing basis. So there are challenges that we're trying to overcome in terms of, we have to try and recognize rather, in terms of how we assess the impact of projects and make sure that they are the most effective that they can be. Having said that, can we be quicker? Yes. Do we need to be quicker? Absolutely. Federated States of Micronesia. We have a project, the project actually you mentioned with MCT, that's the quickest one we've ever done. We did that in 36 days from board approval through to first disbursement. So, and actually it was less than 9 months from receiving the first project proposal, the reviews of that project, getting it to our board for approval, and getting the first money out of the door. Because it's one thing to say, we've approved a climate finance project, great. It's another thing to actually get the money out of the door. I think that's the key indicator. Has the money been transferred? Has the money been paid? So we did that in 36 days for this project in MCT, in FSM, in Federated States of Micronesia. But that is, that's at the quickest end of the scale. We need to make that the norm rather than the exception. There were reasons why we were able to do that, and I think we have to look at how we can replicate that across the range of projects that we have. One reason in that country was that we had very strong dialogue with the country and with Micronesia Conservation Trust as well, to make sure that they understood from the outset what they were trying to achieve and how that would match our objectives. One of the key challenges we face is that if we often receive project proposals that are essentially not climate projects. They might be an infrastructure or a development project, and we cannot fund that unless it has climate at its heart, because that's our mandate. That's what we're given the money for. We cannot use it to build a bridge for economic development. We can use it to aid with climate objectives. Often we get projects at the early stage which don't meet our criteria. They don't meet the criteria to be a climate project that's going to have an impact. What we found is if we work at the earliest stage in co-creating those projects and talking to the accredited entities and talking to the country before they get to the point of filling out the 80-page form with the 10 annexes to look at the environmental assessment, etc., then we can help to produce much better quality projects which can go through our system much faster. So rather than receiving 80 pages and then we review those 80 pages and send back 90 pages, and then the entity reviews those 90 pages and sends back 100 pages, then what we do is we can sit together. Often it means going to the country, doing what we call a write shop, where we sit together for 2-3 days and just plan the project, just write it, just say, what are your country priorities? What can you do as an accredited entity? Okay, let's design a project. That can be a very short, intense sprint, which can help you to produce much higher quality projects once they come into our system. If they're a higher quality, we can then deal with them much more quickly, process them and move them through. So there are things that we can do. Having said that, there are also things that we can do ourselves as a fund to make ourselves more efficient. And we are working on that, and we recognize that. How can we reduce the time taken to review proposals? How can we make sure that when we provide feedback, we provide it in a simple and productive way rather than saying, no, that doesn't work for us, it doesn't meet our criteria. That's not very helpful, but saying, okay, if you design the project like this instead, then it's much more likely to get our board's approval. That's probably helpful feedback. So there are things we're doing. We have a new CEO, Mafalda Duarte, who's just come in a few months ago, and she's committed to try to improve access to climate funding by simplifying our processes and streamlining those processes so we can get access more quickly. So yeah, there's a lot more things that we need to do. We do recognize that, and we've been talking the last 2 weeks at COP with many of the countries who are beneficiaries, with many of our project partners, about exactly that issue. How can we become more efficient? How can we deliver better quality projects faster? There's not one single solution, I'm afraid, but we have to try and make sure we can deliver that more quickly so that we can respond to the urgent challenges that we're facing. Just to come to Adil's question, first of all, you mentioned loss and damage, that you're working on that. It's true that that's not our direct mandate, and there has been at COP this year the creation of this new fund, not yet being given a name. If there's any suggestions, I suspect it'll end up being the Loss and Damage Fund, but anyway, it's a new fund to address loss and damage. That is filling a gap that the Green Climate Fund and other funds are not currently filling in being able to respond immediately to the kind of climate shocks, climate disasters that do happen. But having said that, already GCF, we're contributing a lot of our work towards loss and damage in a broader sense. Our role is very often in relation to preventing and averting crises. So we provide, for example, $900 million worth of our investments in projects are in early warning systems. So how do we provide systems to try to provide advanced warning of these disasters to the populations so that they can reduce the loss and damage that would happen as a result? It's not going to stop it, but it's going to inform the population. It's going to help to protect critical infrastructure. It's going to put in place procedures to safeguard people's lives through that process. So we have a lot of impact in terms of our investment at that end. Then the other end we come in is at the other end of the scale. After the disaster has gone through, after it's passed through, after you've gone through the initial humanitarian response phase, you then need to build back. And when you build back, you need to make sure that you build back better and not that you don't take the cheapest route, you don't take the easy route to building back infrastructure, for example, which will be destroyed by the next typhoon. You make sure you invest in infrastructure that is resilient. You make sure you put in place systems, water systems, energy systems that are resilient. So we're doing a lot of work on that as well. For example, in Barbados, I visited a project which is reinforcing the resilience of their water system. You find very often that when a hurricane or a tornado passes through, there's an initial disaster, people's lives are lost in the initial physical damage that's caused, in the flooding that's caused, people drown, etc. But then the next phase is disease, and that happens because you don't get access to clean water. Once your water supplies, your energy supplies are turned off, then the population is really at risk and really vulnerable. So building resilient water systems can help to protect against the impact of those kind of climate disasters, and we do a lot of work in that area as well. But sorry, that was a little bit of an aside, but your question was actually one that I don't have an answer to. How much money is needed to finance the transition towards low economy futures? I don't know. As a Green Climate Fund, we don't do the research on that. I can tell you that the demand is far larger than our ability to supply that. And I can tell you that we need to mobilize private resources as well as public resources to do that. There have been lots of different estimates done by research institutes, by IPCC, etc., to try to identify and put a figure on that. The figure seems to get larger every year. But on the other hand, the return on that investment is also seeming to get larger. In other words, it costs money, but it's by far the best thing to do, just simply in financial terms, because you get a return on the investment. Why are we not doing it then? If it makes financial sense, why are we not doing that? Often it's because there are barriers to private sector investment. It might make sense over the long term to invest in renewable energy, but if the upfront costs are higher than using kerosene, for example, which is a shorter term solution, then even though over 5 years it makes sense, if your upfront costs are very high because you can't get a loan in your country, and if you can get a loan, the interest rate is very high, and the tenor, the length of that loan is very short, then as a small business, if you've got machinery that's powered by kerosene right now, you're not going to transition towards a lower carbon solution because you don't have the funds initially to do that, even though you know it makes sense over a longer period of time. So that's where climate finance comes in. We can de-risk and we can reduce the upfront costs by coming in at the early stages, and then we can spread out the repayments so that the project can pay for itself over the longer term and make it more accessible. So that's a long way of saying I don't know the answer to your question. The second part of your question was, do we take contributions from the private sector or just the public sector? At the moment, our contributions are from governments. They're from contributor parties to the UNFCCC, primarily developed country parties, also from some regions, some subnational regions and cities as well, but primarily it's exclusively from public sector, and primarily it's from country parties. Could we take contributions from, for example, foundations in the private sector? Yes, we could. Our board is looking at that issue. With a change in policy, we'd be able to accept that. But in fact, already we're working together with foundations of the private sector, but at the programmatic level. So there's a difference there. One question is the money that comes directly into our resources, into our bank account, which we then recycle and reuse. The second question is when we create a program or a project, which other sources of funding can we bring together? Can we crowd in as private capital or as public sector? So that in that level, we're already getting those contributions. We're partnering with foundations. We're partnering with other agencies, with other funders, governments in developing countries to make sure that that works. So we're already leveraging our money in that way. What we haven't done yet is to say, going upstream towards our actual replenishment, the resources that GCF receives directly, we're not yet receiving resources beyond governmental resources. We could do that, but I think what's important, however you do it, is that we find ways to unlock the other sources of funding, particularly private sector, because that's really where there's the far greater volumes of funding that are going to flow in future, where we need to find the solutions to deliver climate finance.
Thank you. You've been really generous with your time, Simon. I think from what you've, how you've spoken about the challenges that you're trying to address, really the movement towards making it easier for the end user to access, to simplify the system because it is becoming increasingly more unwieldy. You've mentioned the Loss and Damage Fund. And from a legislative point of view, it's much harder to seek accountability. So this morning we had a really interesting presentation. We were looking at the role of art and culture industry for climate action. And there's a new initiative that's been launched here in the region, and that is to use money from art sales by collectors, auction houses, to invest that into climate finance. So it raises a big question about how that is channeled to the end user. Accountability from a legislative point of view, how you can ensure that anticipated outcomes are delivered. So that's something that we're going to be looking at in the context of Globe's work with many other parliamentary networks, how we can support and empower parliaments themselves to ensure that on the receiving end, they undertake those audits. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to be done also in increasing people's understanding of what you do. This has been really helpful for us. And so just want to end by thanking you so much for your time. And I'm sure we'll come back to you with more questions. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thanks so much.